Welcome to another edition of the Last Negroes at Harvard podcast. I'm Kent Garrett. There were 18 of us in the Harvard College class of 1963. We are all over 83 years old now, and for the last 5 years we have produced a weekly podcast. Our guest this week is Leslie Stainton. She has served on the board of directors of both the Slave Dwelling Project and Coming to the Table. She is a two-time Fulbright recipient and a former lecturer in creative nonfiction at the University of Michigan Residential College. Her latest book is titled Scarlett, Slavery's Enduring Legacy in an American Family. I'm joined by 20 of my Harvard classmates.
Hi there, I'm Richard Rothstein, class of 63, as you'll hear over and over again. A writer, author, journalist, mostly retired now in Berkeley, California, because that's where my grandchildren are.
Of course.
Okay, Bill.
Bill Collins grew up in Boston, but now living in Aiken, South Carolina. After 20 years in the Navy and nuclear power, worked for Westinghouse for a little while in Pittsburgh, and then moved here to work at this Van River site for a few years, managing nuclear waste cleanup from the Cold War. And but we stayed here. It's a pleasant place, politics aside.
Okay. Alden.
Depends where you are, too.
Alden.
Alden Briscoe, grew up in Northwestern Connecticut, have lived in various places, including Aiken, South Carolina, Baltimore, Maryland, New Haven, Connecticut, Washington, D.C., Flint, Michigan, Chicago, and I live outside of San Francisco and San Mateo, California. My wife and I have a fundraising consulting firm.
Okay, John.
Hi, John Woodford. I'm here in Ann Arbor, same as Leslie, where I was editing and writing for the university for a number of years.
Okay, Liz.
Hi, I'm Liz Morey, and I'm originally from California, also class of 63, currently living in Tacoma Park, Maryland, and particularly interested in your discussion because I've spent some time tracking down the descendants of the ancestors that were enslaved by my ancestors.
I look forward to hearing more about where your ancestors were, etc.
Yeah, in Charlottesville.
Okay.
Okay, and Connie.
Yes, I'm here in New York City. I am a rarity. I am a native of New York City. And my father even my grandmother's family was also from New York. So I'm a New Yorker.
Wow.
I was in the same class as everybody else, went to Harvard Law School right after college, and am now retired, and totally enjoying my retirement. And I look forward to hearing what your story is.
You don't sound like a New Yorker, right?
I don't. Well, no, but I'm not a white ethnic.
Okay. Ron.
They're the ones who sound like New Yorkers.
Yeah.
Well, along with Connie, I could claim to be a New Yorker because my mother's doctor was in Manhattan and I was born at Lenox Hill Hospital. But we lived in New Jersey. I grew up in New Jersey, and a week after graduation, I was working at WGBH as a producer trainee and have worked in TV and video all my life. And now I do video as a volunteer.
Okay, Ron, you've forced me to confess. I was born in New Jersey.
Oh my God, we
But I
traded.
came back to New York at like about 5 days old.
Oh, so maybe we were switched at birth.
Hamp.
Okay, I was born in Roosevelt Hospital in New York City,
Okay, we really are getting down to the details now.
and I grew up on Long Island, New York, and I live in Nashville, and I'm still working as a clinical psychologist.
Okay, and Leslie, welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Well, you need to tell us about yourself, Ken.
Well, I was in the class of 63. I've been in TV news for a long time. I worked for Brokaw for Dan Rather for CBS for 10 years, and then 10 years at NBC with Brokaw. And then I've done a lot of documentaries and that sort of stuff. So,
What
And
an
he's a New
interesting
Yorker. He's a New Yorker.
I'm a New Yorker
Yorker.
as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is just an impressive crowd, so I'll try not to be nervous.
Oh, no, we're
it's-
nice.
yeah, yeah.
Don't be nervous.
So I'm Leslie Stainton. I was born in Lancaster General Hospital in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. I grew up there, went to graduate school in Franklin and Marshall, and then graduate school at UMass Amherst. So I'm sort of an Easterner by heart, but marriage brought me to Ann Arbor, and that's where I am. And how I've gotten to know John over I don't know how many years, but it's
Oh boy,
a number of years.
30 at least,
Um,
40.
You think? 10? I don't know.
30.
And John is a hoot, as you probably know. He's a total hoot to work with, and completely irreverent, if I may say so, which was always a wonderful, just a breath of fresh air in the midst of all this corporate, university stuff, bureaucracy. So thank you. Thanks for inviting me. So this is the first time I've talked in this kind of venue about this book, which is just coming out, I don't know, in a couple of days officially. So it's kind of casual, and you're in some ways you're my, I don't know, my experimental group. So I look forward to hearing your stories, and I also, if there are things that you think I'm missing or whatever, just holler. It'll be really helpful to hear that. So my understanding is I should just blather for a little bit about the book and my past or my background in researching it, and then we open up the
Right.
doors, the whatever we call it. And I too, I was actually graduate of 1973 in or was it 77? I can't even remember now. Maybe 77. That's right. For Franklin and Marshall, and I am of that age where I sometimes forget what I'm saying in the middle of a sentence. I doubt that it ever happens to any of you, but
Of course not.
so I actually spent this morning doing a crib sheet for myself, but we'll see how this works. So, and thank you, John, in particular, for making this connection. I recently came across a quote that I thought, oh my God, this is so brilliant. It's written a writer, Olga Prumas. And she says, a single question can define a whole book. And that really spoke to me. That's kind of how I worked. And this question for me was, I grew up knowing that my family had owned slaves, as we used to say. Now we say we had enslaved people. But
Nice.
but I never knew the details. In fact, I was basically told we were good slaveholders. And as I later learned when I started working on this material, there is no such thing as a good slaveholder. It's pretty quite awful. So I set out, and this is the third book I've written, and about 15 years ago, I set out to really try to learn the truth of my family, which is a task I encourage any of you and all of you to do if you haven't. I just wanted to find out what the real story was, and I also wanted to know what the legacy of all of that harm was. And it turns out there's quite a long and ongoing legacy, and we're living it now. I think I'm among friends here, but the stuff that's happening in the government is it's a direct legacy from that. And I don't think it's much of a coincidence that all of this Trump stuff has happened since the election of Barack Obama. And I'm guessing you've maybe addressed that. The other really driving question that got me going, and this was after I started researching the story, my uncle told me that he had learned from my grandmother, his mother, that she was born in Georgia in 1898. And she was a child, obviously, then in the early 20th century. And she had a memory, very vague as a 3 or 4-year-old, of being in the Scarlett household in Brunswick, Georgia, at night with the Scarlett women, while the Scarlett men were out in the dark doing something nefarious. She didn't know what, she never knew what, but that was that's my uncle told me this, when I started working on this book, and I went, whoa, I never heard that. She never talked about it. She never went back. My uncle thought she was haunted all her life. And I set out, so I really wanted to find out what in the world is she talking about? So this would have been post Civil War in the lynching era. And what did she know? So I set out looking for records of lynchings with the Scarletts, which were my family in Brunswick, Georgia. And I didn't, you don't find it. Basically, there's a ton of reportage, as some of you may know, about lynchings, but basically the characters who show up in those reports are the victims, not the people who perpetrated the crime. And so I kept looking, and it was in vain. I didn't see anything with Scarlett complicity. So, and then ultimately, I did find out. And yeah, I was going to say that I'm always struck by Brian Stevenson's terminology. He calls it not, we talk about the Jim Crow era, which is such an innocuous name and really wrong. And I much prefer Brian Stevenson's term, the era of racial terror, which was really from basically the end of Reconstruction to 1950, when lynchings were replaced by legal executions largely in the South of African American people, largely men. So so I set out to see what I could find about this, and I almost got to the end of writing the book, and I thought, well, I'm just going to have to write around this, because I really didn't find any evidence of Scarlet men or Scarletts involved in lynchings. And then all of a sudden, and it was sort of a circuitous route, but I suddenly stumbled on the story of one of my Scarlett ancestors in 1901 who was deeply involved, complicit in the quote unquote legal execution or hanging of an African American man who was 18 years old at the time. And I was able to uncover this horrific story. There was a newspaper article and a series that I hadn't known about. And here's this man named Fricey Griffith, who was killed in 1901 and hanged publicly in Brunswick, Georgia, where my family was from. So that became sort of, not a centerpiece, an end piece for the book. And my grandmother's nightmare was indeed true, that, her ancestors, her uncle, was absolutely complicit in the then legal execution of this young man. So, so anyhow, that's where I was. There were two historical books that kind of framed my research. Again, we're the Scarletts of Brunswick, Georgia, right north of the Florida border on the coast. And they were significant enslavers, excuse me. At the height of their wealth, they had about 500 people to their name. So they weren't the biggest American enslavers, but they were up there. Most Americans had no enslaved people at all. Those who did had maybe, I don't know, 8 or 10 or something. And then the really major ones had, in 1,000 or possibly 2,000. And my family had 500 people in bondage. So we were big. So the two books that really helped me contextualize what I was doing. One is Fanny Kemble's Journal of a Residence in a Georgia, on a Georgia plantation. It was written while she was a British actress, or actor, as my book likes to say, who came to the United States in the 1830s. She married Pierce Butler, who was a major enslaver. And Kemble herself was absolutely opposed to slavery. Britain had outlawed it in 1830 or 18, I can't remember the actual date, but in early 19th century. And she was absolutely opposed to it. She was also a Victorian, so she had her prejudices and this and that. But she wrote this book. She went down to Georgia. She married this enslaver, Pierce Butler, who was very wealthy. And she went down to Georgia in 1838 and 1839, and she was horrified by what she saw. And she wrote a book about this, the journal of a residence on a Georgia plantation. But the book was not published until 1863 during the Civil War, and she published it then. She was by then divorced, so Pierce Butler couldn't harm her or her children at that point. And she wanted to publish this in order to try to dissuade the British government from supporting the Confederacy in 1863. And it's one of the most important sources, with all of its flaws, which are, there's a lot of racism in there implicit, but it's one of the most important documents written by a white enslaver, documenting what slavery was really like on a Southern plantation in those years. So it's very important. And it turns out the plantations where she stayed with her husband, Rhett Butler, I mean, you can see them over Pierce Butler, were about 15 miles from my family's plantations. So the information is quite relevant to my family's story. The other book, surprise hint, Rhett Butler, that sort of helped frame my story was Margaret Mitchell's Gone with the Wind. She used the name Scarlett, knowing about my family, the Scarletts of Southern Georgia. And there was an exchange of reading about that. And she was aware of our family. But her book, of course, as you probably know, was, just horribly racist. It's a fantasy. It's the lost cause fantasy of so many Confederates and Confederate heirs. And astonishingly, I looked this up just 2 days ago, it still sells an estimated 30 million copies a year worldwide. That's just shocking to me. When I taught at University of Michigan, I would talk to students about this. And early on when I talked to them, they kind of knew the book, they knew Scarlett. Later in the late like around 2021 or whatever, and I would mention it, and they didn't know the story. They didn't know Gone with the Wind, which I thought was sort of interesting and possibly very encouraging. But anyhow, so a lot of the book that I've written called Scarlett is trying to debunk and tell the truth behind Margaret Mitchell's fantasy of what the South was like. And actually she's pretty bad about the, pre-war and war, but she's really awful about the era of racial terror. Those first years after the war, I mean, it's sort of shocking to go back and read it. Okay, so I'll just kind of briefly run through the history. The Scarlett family began enslaving people of African descent in around 1812 or something like that. I spent years trawling through family documents that I inherited, went through them, got all sorts of, correspondence, letters, this and that. I also worked archives in Brunswick and in Savannah, the Georgia Historical Society. I visited lands and places where my family had in plantations. They grew mostly cotton. I actually hired a boat, piloted by two men, several years ago, and we retraced a route by boat that about 20 enslaved people fled the Scarletts in 1862 and went into by then the Union Army had taken over much of the Georgia coast, and so they went as refugees with those. But that was a perilous journey, and I can go into great detail about that if anybody's interested, but they survived. And then through a contact in Brunswick, I found out the name of two of the people who helped make that escape from the Scarletts in 1862. And I was able to contact their descendants who still live in Brunswick, many of them. And I went down to their family reunion in 2011, introduced myself. It was a little scary. And they turned out to be, and I shared the correspondence that I had telling them about their history and these people, their ancestors who had escaped the Scarletts in a quite brave way. And it was material, it was information they didn't have. And that's one of the most important things white ancestors can do is if you have any connection to any information about enslavement in your family or in friends' families or whatever, share it with people of the descendants of enslaved people because they're searching for this material. As you probably know, I mean, there were no records, there were no names, nothing about enslaved people. The only time that information came out was in 1870 with the first
I'm so
census.
surprised they didn't have a family legend about it.
I do. That one of the legends was that uh, one of our ancestors, one of my grandmother's aunts, wrote a letter, a scathing letter. Turns out to be a legend. I've since learned since this book came out. She wrote to Margaret Mitchell, said, "How could you take this? How could you take our name and dirty it up and all of this?" And then she burned the letter. Well, actually, just a couple of weeks ago, somebody wrote and said, "Actually, I've found the letter she wrote," and she was really kind of complimentary of Margaret Mitchell and all of this. So that's interesting, and I need to put a blog post on my website about that. But and it's one of the things I'm sure many of you know. You write a book, and then all of a sudden you learn things you wish you'd known when you were writing the book. So it's kind of like, oh, damn it, I didn't have that.
Now, the people that you visited who helped the slaves run away.
Say this again.
The helpers of the runaway slaves, were they white or black?
Black.
And they had no stories about being
nothing.
Underground Railroad people or anything.
There was no Underground Railroad down there. That doesn't really enter into my story. But the short fact is that when the Union Army took over the coasts of, I don't know if North Carolina was part of that, but definitely South Carolina and Georgia, and possibly parts of Florida. Again, I'm not quite sure on that, but definitely South Carolina and Georgia. And that was in 1861, or I'm sorry, 1862. And immediately enslaved people who lived along that area started fleeing. And it was and they would go to the Union troops as refugees. And so that's what these descendants that I knew, they were called the Hippards. Later on, I learned their names, and I just want to say we've become really dear friends. And actually, probably later today, I'm calling one of them. I owe her a letter, but that is one of the really beautiful, blessed things that has come out of all of this work was meeting these people. We've known each other now for over 10 years, actually like 15 years, and we are. Somewhere I can't find it, but I have her. Where is it? I have a letter that she just wrote me, and I have huge files of letters that we've exchanged over the years. So this was but it was wonderful. And one of them wrote to me shortly after we met in 2011, said, "Thank you for uncovering this history. We didn't know that our family we were heroes," which was really, breathtaking to know. And we didn't know that we had this history and that we helped save. And they actually not only escaped and joined, went to the Union side, but they showed the Union troops in Brunswick where Scarletts had stored supplies for their own people, food and grain and all sorts of stuff. And so they gave that to the Union Army. Yeah. And they, I guess, yeah. The correspondent back in 2011 said, they were heroes and they helped the Union Army. So that was, to be able to share that information is, and I look forward. Do you go by Elizabeth or do you go by?
I go by Liz.
Liz.
Yeah.
Or Liz. Okay, Liz. So I'm eager to hear what you've learned about your family, but this is just one of the wonderful things that has come out of the research.
One last question. Have you to discover any of the people that your parents owned or your family owned? Have you contacted any of them?
Well, they're long gone. They were.
They're descendants.
Oh yeah, those are the people. So these people, the Hippards in particular, I've gotten to know, and Gertrude and Margie and Nancy. They have different last names, but they're all in Brunswick. And then there was another one who since died named Avadel Grant, who I'll tell you this, when I went to the reunion in 2011, and it was a little brass, I got their names. A woman who does a lot of research in Brunswick area made the contact for me, gave me their phone number. I called up. I got one of their descendants, and I'm like, "Hello, we don't know each other, but my family enslaved members of your family want to talk." I mean, it was
Yeah, I could talk at some length, but I think that we had knowledge because an aunt of mine wrote a family history.
oh,
Uh,
that's
and so that was the start, and I started looking at that back around basically around the time of George Floyd. Um, and
yeah,
then we were very fortunate. So when I say we, I have a cousin who lives in downtown DC, my cousin Henry. Um, we were very fortunate because we found a woman named Shelley Murphy, and I don't know whether you know Shelley or not.
don't
Shelley
think so.
is a full-time genealogist working for the University of Virginia.
Okay.
And her job is to find names for the 4,000 enslaved laborers who
Wonderful.
built the University of Virginia. And so we got in touch with Shelley, and Shelley said, "Oh, would you like to know some of the descendants on the other side?" I was like, "What?" And so we were able to meet with two people whose, I think, second great grandfather had been enslaved by our family. And of course, this was a mother and daughter. The mother's in her 70s, the daughter's in her 50s, and they live in the area around Charlottesville. And of course, they were really, really happy to have my aunt's book. Um, but again, it's the kind of thing where our forebears were, we thought, oh, kind of intellectuals, ministers, teachers, doctors, that kind of thing. And one of the things that we discovered was that one of our ancestors in the 1860 census, there were 62 enslaved people. Um,
62.
yes,
Yeah,
right.
that's big.
It is big.
They must
There's
have farmed or something. They weren't ministers.
well, they were. I mean, this particular man was a doctor. He'd had training as a midwife in Sligo before he came to this country. But yeah, he was a doctor, but he also had 62 enslaved
What
people.
did he do with 62? I
Well,
wonder.
I think no,
Put him
I
to
think
work.
he did live out in the countryside, and he was a
Yeah.
farmer. So
Was it tobacco in North
Yeah,
America?
I believe it. Yeah, it was tobacco because I also found online in 2018 a another kind of memoir, if you will, of somebody who I don't know, but is probably a fourth or fifth cousin,
Yeah.
which is pretty much a lost cause memoir and is
Mhm.
quite upsetting. But it talks about a farm which was ceded to children by our ancestor. So that's kind of as far as we go. I'm a member of Coming to the Table. I'm
Oh
involved
yeah, okay. Me
in
too.
a Okay, I'm involved in a writing pod with them. I'm involved in the local chapter. I run a book club here locally.
Got
Um,
it.
so I
So
do what
you
I
know
do.
Prinny Anderson and
I know who she, yeah,
and
I haven't met her
yeah.
personally. Yeah, right. So that's kind of the short version of my story. I don't want to take over the.
No, no.
So Leslie,
Coming to the Table for people who are curious is an organization that I think it's in its 20th year now, and it brings together. Initially, it brought together descendants of enslavers, and of course, in many instances, they're descendants of both because there was so much rape and
Right.
everything that
Right.
went on. And they do a lot of their work online. Um, and but they also have periodically, like everything, it's every 2 years now, a national gathering. I've been to several of them. I haven't lately, and I was on the board for a couple of years back, and it's been a while. But yeah, it's a really wonderful organization, and there are a lot of local groups. So yeah, the fact that do you get together every month or?
The writing pod, we get
Oh,
together every 4 to 6 weeks, and we are national. There are not very many of us. There are 6 or 7 in our particular group, but we have
Okay,
people from California, from Minnesota, et cetera,
yeah.
Kentucky. The local group gets together about once a month, and the book club gets together about once a month. We just celebrated Maryland Emancipation Day.
Oh wow. Okay.
And there's a local living history farm here, which is devoted quite a bit to African American history.
Which I'm trying to think where I was in Durham, which is where Prinny lives, and there's a uh, um, um, a former plantation that's now open. And anyhow, what's the name of the farm that you're
It's called Button Farm. And
Button?
the one thing that I'll say before, again, I don't want to kind of
Hmm.
monopolize here, is that the man who runs it, who is Black, his name is Tony Cohen, Cohen.
Okay.
Yeah, right. And
He's a little bit Black.
he's pretty, he's the real deal. 30 years ago, he's a historian, and 30 years ago, he walked from this area to Canada following the Underground Railroad.
Oh my goodness.
And next May, and as I say, he's probably around 60 now. He's a fit 60. He's going to do it again.
Oh wow.
He's going to
That's a
celebrate.
long journey.
It is. He's starting at the beginning of May. He wants to cross over to Canada on July 1st, which I guess is Canada Day, and then be there for July 4th.
Wow. Wow.
So yeah, it's very cool. It really is very cool.
To me, it's surprising that there weren't more connections maintained consistently between slave and former masters, particularly if they were house slaves that they had grown up with and known, had been their nurses, etc. The way somehow the Civil War just broke it.
Well, and I think
very strange that they didn't keep up connections of their own, but I haven't heard of any,
I'm just going to say these were not friendly relations. The people enslaved. You see it now more with, so many people in contemporary or when we were growing up, had Black servants in their houses. My grandparents had one, and also many white Americans who grew up, particularly in the South, were raised by people of color and not by their own family. I mean, these wealthy families. So there's more of an attachment there. But I think, the Hippards, whom I've gotten to know, who are the descendants of people enslaved, my understanding is, the Matilda and King Hippard are the ones who spearheaded the escape of enslaved people from the Scarletts in 1862. And they actually ended up living on Scarlet land, but there was no connection. I don't think there was a lot of love lost. That shouldn't.
You're probably right.
Well, actually, the wonderful story about the Hippards when they escaped was, and I have this from family letters who, of course, felt absolutely betrayed by these actions. But in fact, what I learned was Matilda, who may or may not have been married to King Hippard at that point, but they eventually were married. And I also learned that she was a mixed race daughter of one of the enslavers. And there was a lot of breeding going on, and I'll tell you something about that in a minute. But they, where was I going with that? They did not, there was no connection afterwards. There was no love lost. And in fact, when the family letter talks about Matilda, who was their mom Matilda, which is the term they used for mammy, and she, this gets too complicated. I don't want to go into the weeds, but she was asked, the family itself, when the Union soldiers took over the coast, the Scarlett family, the white Scarletts, went off into the western part of the state of Georgia in order to protect themselves from the soldiers. And she asked Matilda, whom we trusted with everything, she said in her letter, to store all of the belongings of some of the Scarlett family in one of their they had a lot of land and several plantations. She asked her to store their stuff in one of these plantation houses, which apparently she did. And then Matilda went, and when they decided to escape, because they were kind of left alone without the white overseers, she took an axe and broke into those trunks and took blankets and clothing and all sorts of stuff for their flight.
How was that known? How was her deed?
It's in the letter so my ancestor, my white ancestor, who was, kind of a Scarlett O'Hara figure, she writes in this letter in 1863, she tells some of the members of the family who were actually out in Texas, it gets complicated. She says, Matilda went in and took an axe and did this, and we
Was
never
she
thought
there?
she would do this. We
She
thought she
wasn't
was
there.
loyal. Hmm?
How did she know? She wasn't there.
She actually, because several months later they went back and
But she wasn't there when she wasn't there. This is when I read I wondered that there was nobody there when the stuff was seized. So
well, her
someone,
husband was coming back and forth from the western part of the state, or
in
not the
other words,
western,
but
just
they wouldn't have known whether Matilda did it or a guy with her or
well, there were
who
very
would
few
know?
people left. Many of the enslaved people had fled. Most of them
Right,
had fled, but Matilda
right.
was left because, as my ancestor, Scarlett ancestor Fanny says, we trusted her with everything. So we left the stuff with her. We told her not to damage it, save it for the family when they come back after the war, blah, blah. And then she went there and she discovered not only did Matilda not protect and
Right.
guard these items, but
She
she
masterminded
took,
the theft.
and I love the
But no
fact
one
that she
really
took it.
no one really, it's conjecture, I think.
Actually,
Well,
you're right, John.
But
If
she herself
Matilda had
revealed
done
the
it,
act.
why she wouldn't have needed to smash it. She would
my
just open it.
understanding is that there really were almost no more enslaved people left on the
Yeah, but
on
if
the.
Matilda was there, she has the keys.
Yeah, that's probably right too. She had the keys,
Mm.
and
So you're right, John. It was probably somebody else that she told them where it was, and somebody
yeah.
else.
Well,
Yeah,
Leslie, let me
she
ask
was a
you this:
novelist.
how was your book set up and structured and organized? The
How
book.
was it set up and organized?
Well, how is it structured?
It kind of goes back and forth. I mean, it's more or less chronological in terms of the history,
Uh-huh.
but I intersperse a lot of my own research and going. So it goes back and forth between contemporary and from the period, and then the later period, the post-war period, which became so violent against people of color. Um, so, but it's basically chronological. But it goes all the way up to, this is jumping around. It goes all the way up to the thing that really shocked me was in 2020 when I thought I was finished with this book, and then I discovered the terrible story of the legal execution of this 18-year-old in 1901. At that same time, Ahmaud Arbery in Brunswick, Georgia, was murdered. I mean, it was February 2020. And I don't know how many, if you know this story, but I mean, the
The
people
guy
that
who was
came there
running, the guy
were
who was
not
running in
elected.
his neighborhood, remember?
Yeah,
Right.
Oh,
right.
Oh,
It
okay.
was in the same neighborhood that is on
Yeah.
land that used to be owned, was plantation land by the Scarletts.
Yeah.
And it's also so the people who murdered Ahmaud Arbery in 2020, three white men, and they were, I think they even said this, they were protecting their homes. And I have records, and this is from family documents, that in 1861, when the war broke out, one of my Scarlet ancestors, actually a couple of them were involved in, and they set up a vigilante group, and they wrote to the governor um, of Georgia and said, we have this vigilante group. They're called the Satilla Wildcats. And by the way, Margaret Mitchell talks about a vigilante group during the war, and they were called the oh God, I can't remember now, something, but they were also called the Wildcats. And the job of all of these 19th century vigilante groups, they were all white, was to protect our homes. So the history is so direct.
Yeah,
Here
linear.
we are in 2020, forming a vigilante group on land where my ancestors enslaved hundreds of people, and here is this group, these three men who fancy themselves vigilantes and to protect our home, and they murder this 18-year-old innocent man who was just taking a jog. So that's look, the story just keeps going on. It's incredible, and I don't know where it is now. I mean, what I mean is, with the new administration, relatively new administration, and the blatant racism of this current administration. I mean, what's happening now that we do or don't know about. Um, I, this is backtracking a little bit, but I wanted to tell Liz, you talked about Virginia and the archive. And I recently, actually through coming to the table, maybe you were there was a talk with Joby Hill,
No.
she's doing a PhD in history, this kind of history in Durham, but she's researching a plantation in in Virginia. And I think the archives are at University of Virginia. She's been working a lot with them about uh, I'm looking for the name of it now. Um, breeding plantations, which is something kind of new, and I didn't really know about when I was doing this work. This talk that she gave was really fascinating. But every white plantation, every big white plantation was breeding people. I mean, Thomas Jefferson writes about a woman, a woman of color, an enslaved person who's turning out a new baby, a new child every 2 years is a valuable asset to the plantation. So they were all doing that because after 1830, you couldn't import
right, couldn't bring
slaves,
anybody in.
people
Right.
from Africa. It didn't mean that stopped, but the legal slave trade, Atlantic slave trade stopped. So these plantations were doing, encouraging breeding, but there were also breeding plantations. And actually, what's the name? The author of James, that just won the Pulitzer last.
Percival Everett.
Yeah.
Percival Everett.
And he writes about, that's one place where that book ends up, is in a breeding plantation. But apparently they really were, I mean, there were plantations. And actually, Prinny Anderson from Coming to the Table just discovered that one of her distant ancestors had a breeding plantation, which was actually where you bring in women and, they would have certain buildings, infirmaries, etc., where women were just, they were breeding, they were being raped and bred. And one of the stories that I landed,
they chose the fathers for being the strongest or the best workers. They were like breeding the way you do cattle. You choose the finest specimens.
I don't know the details for sure, but I'm sure, I imagine that was part of it. And one of the stories I uncovered about my family was in 1858, one of the last illegal enslaved ships came over from Africa and fetched up on Jekyll Island, which is right around the corner from where my ancestors lived. And actually, one of my ancestors went, and he had 8 enslaved men pilot him to Jekyll Island, because this was totally illicit. It all had to happen secretly. But this ship called the Wanderer brought over something like 400 enslaved people in horrendous condition. I mean, worse than usual. It was a makeshift. It was a sort of makeshift yacht. It was a yacht that they turned into a slave ship, and the enslaved people were put in decks 18 or 19 inches tall for the transatlantic crossing, which would have been, at least a month. And there were 400 at least, mostly men. And they fetched up they landed on Jekyll Island, and my great-great-great-grandfather, who was the starter, Francis Muir Scarlett, who sort of launched our family into slavery, or into the practice of the business of slavery. He had these 8 enslaved men row his 5-year-old grandson to Jekyll Island early in the morning to get one of these enslaved people. And he wanted the 5-year-old because he thought it would be good for him to see this business. So that's how I got that story. But the enslaved people, so the grandson actually recorded what he remembered. And these enslaved people who, fell off this ship, I mean, they were naked, they were whatever. You can imagine, 400 people after a month on the ocean in these kinds of conditions. They were apparently, they were starving. They were searching the ground for mice to eat. That's how desperate they were. And my great-great-grandfather bought one of these people who was supposedly a prince or a king of Western Africa, Eastern Africa, Western, whatever. And he took him back to one of his plantations and tried to turn him into an overseer, which didn't work very well because as you can imagine, this guy was not happy and not cooperative. So then they punished him severely, which is the only real evidence I have in documents that my family, whipped and abused. But clearly, that's how it all worked. That's how overseers worked. This whipping was huge, and then they rented him out to fellow planters at $100 a day as a, quote, producer of children.
Whoa.
So that was happening. So these are the truths that, Mrs. Mitchell doesn't tell. I'll just say, sorry, I'm rambling all over the place and you guys stop me and ask questions, but Margaret Mitchell is I don't mean to exalt her. She was born in 1898, pretty much the same time as my grandmother. Um, she's a complicated person. Andrew Young actually did a documentary kind of praising her. She actually helped fund an all-Black hospital in Atlanta, and she's also was a major contributor to Morehouse College. But she didn't want her name associated with any of this. And as she wrote to the president of Morehouse, you will understand, it would be not appropriate for me to use my name. So she wrote this scathing book, this, racist diatribe, which is so popular. But she also was, quietly funding some African American causes, which is sort of interesting. And the whole history is just so freaking complicated in this way. So why don't I stop there?
All right, questions.
Yeah, I've got a question.
Yeah.
As somebody from the Northeast, I haven't found any evidence that my ancestors were involved in slave trade. But then thinking today, some of them could very easily have sailed slave ships and imported a lot of people. And I didn't know if there was any registry that anybody knew of that gave that information.
That I don't know. I mean, so much of this history is so buried because we wanted to bury it. And,
Yes.
we've taken down all the slave cabins, or many of the slave cabins, all this kind of stuff. I do know, and it might be worth trying to reach out to him, Tom DeWolf, who was one of the founders of Coming to the Table, and wrote a couple of books about his family. He is a descendant of the largest slave trading family in Rhode Island, the DeWolfs. And what's the name of his book?
Well, the name of the movie is called Traces of the Trade.
Traces of the Trade. And
Yeah,
that's
that's the
something you can
movie.
find. And also his cousin has been instrumental in starting this, in founding this organization called Sacred Ground, I think it is, where it's involved with, she's an Episcopal minister. And there are a lot of, they've been doing a lot of workshops, through the Episcopal Church. So, but I could, if you are really interested in reaching out to him, he might be able to tell you something.
Yeah. Thank you.
And there are
all of the New England big trading seafaring families were involved in slave.
Say what?
trade. The New England families who made money off the Asia trade and Atlantic trade, they were all involved in slave trade because the Forbeses, twin sister was married to one of them for a while, but they know that they weren't told it when they were growing up.
Sure.
Recent histories, they know that that's where they got a lot of their wealth.
Well, some of it is, if you just start digging and you start tracing back and, look for archives, you start to uncover, you try to go back through the centuries and find out. The other, in my hometown, Lancaster, and again, slavery was part of the North until I think it was 1830. When Pennsylvania, I think, was the first state to outlaw it. So there's a lot of, it's very possible that you have ancestors pre 1830 who were involved, who I don't know. And it might be a matter of looking for family documents or just talking to people about what they've learned. My hometown, Lancaster, Pennsylvania, which is sort of famously home to Thaddeus Stevens, who was a famous abolitionist, turns out even Thaddeus Stevens was a big proponent of the cotton mills that were part of Lancaster that helped make Lancaster's fortune in the 19th century. And he didn't see the dichotomy, the discrepancy between abolition and supporting cotton mills. Where did the cotton come from? Hello, plantations like my family's. So it's so intertwined in, I think, American history of all places. Michigan, there's not much here. There's largely abuse of indigenous people here. And that's a whole nother, part of these two terrible crimes on which our country is built.
The wealth of our country, yes.
The
wealth of our country.
Yeah.
Built on
Built on the criminal.
Those two things, yeah.
But in various places in the North, early abolitionists were driven out of town and
Sure.
punished. There was a lot of physical violence against anti-slavery people
Yep.
throughout Ohio, Michigan, and elsewhere, Indiana,
Yep.
Illinois.
Illinois.
Yeah.
And then, in 1852, the Fugitive Slave Act was passed, which
Mhm.
meant if an enslaved person escaped to the north, crossing the Ohio River, getting into Ohio, they by legally then they had to return that person, and so that was its own. So you were breaking the law if you harbored people.
Mhm.
It's the Colin, what's his name? Coleman Young. No, Coleman Young. Anyhow, the book, The Underground Railroad, the novel that came out several years ago. That's really
Coleman
Colson.
Whitehead.
yeah,
Whitehead.
Yeah, Colson.
yeah,
What's Coleman? Yeah, what's his last name?
Whitehead.
Whitehead.
Whitehead, isn't
Yeah.
it?
Yeah.
Yeah,
Say it again.
Colson is
Colson
his
Whitehead.
first
Colson.
name.
It's
Yeah.
But
Colson.
one of the great novels about the period is The Known World by Edward P. Jones.
Oh God, that's a brilliant book.
Because that shows it wasn't always just rape going on. There were all sorts of extra families that many Black people throughout the region would know that some people were in these families that were set apart by the slave owners and would hang out with them. The slave owners would go visit them and
Well, and also, if I remember, he writes in that book about Black enslavers. I mean, there were
yeah, there were a few.
African
Yeah,
families.
he does. He
Yeah.
does.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, my mother's family owned slaves, but they were in the nature of like servants or house servants, or they owned a harness shop or like a worker in the
Right.
shop. So I think they owned two people. I mean, it was like not a plantation situation, but that's kind of I kind of feel that having Black History and Black History Month is a real error because it's not Black history, it's American history, and it's all intertwined.
Right, right.
And it should be viewed that way as genuine American history.
Nicole Brown, oh God, this is where I have my little crib notes, who did the 1619 project. She writes
Nicole
a
Jones.
lot
Hannah Jones.
about Nicole Brown.
Jones. Nicole
Yes.
Hannah Jones. Yeah.
Hannah Jones, thank you. Sorry, this is like I'm just trying to memorize all the lines names that I used. She writes about how slavery. I mean, it influenced so much. The division of the highway in Atlanta, Georgia, for instance, was there because they wanted to keep black black families away from white families. So you have this ridiculous highway system that cuts right through, and Atlanta is always clogged. She talks about healthcare, not allowing. I mean, one of the reasons that Americans didn't want universal health care was because then, God forbid, Black people would have access to health care.
That's still true.
We don't want, yeah, it is absolutely. And it's getting worse, so as we know. Not that it's ever gotten better, but just significantly better. But she writes about, all of the different ways that the legacy has endured. What can I say? I mean, I'm talking to the crowd here, I think.
You are
Yeah.
preaching to the choir.
Why?
Yeah. So I'm curious to know, I mean, I really grew up with this myth that we were, good slaveholders. And it's a little bit, like what you just talked about, Connie, that, these stories that we were given. And I'm sure there are obviously degrees, if you have a plantation with 1,000 people, there's probably a lot more violence than there is if you are, enslaving two people who are in your bedroom. But still, because they often had to sleep in the bedroom of the people they were quote unquote owned by. But I'm wondering what you guys grew up with. I mean, hearing about all of this history and any of you, Liz, for instance, who had enslaved ancestors. What were you given the same kinds of myths, or did anybody tell you the truth?
Well, I think nobody talked about it because what happened was that my grandfather, who was born around 1875, I think, basically in the 1890s moved to Butte, Montana, never looked back. And none of the 7 kids ever, well, the 2 oldest went to the University of Virginia, but none of them settled in the South. And so my aunt, this book, there were 3 books that she did, which were basically family history. And she self-published in the 1980s. But I think really until I moved to Maryland, when I lived in California, I never thought about slavery very much. When I moved to Maryland in 2006, I had to really begin to come to grips. And so this was, yeah, it was kind of like, oh yeah, well, we own slaves, but it did not, nothing clicked. And but then once it did, and my aunt's books are you know pretty unreadable. I mean, they're not well written. And but then I made it my business to read it cover to cover and to take note of every enslaved person that was named.
I hope you've, if you haven't already, but shared those names. There are databases. Sharon, what was his last name? But Coming to the Table could tell you about that.
Yeah.
But share those names with,
I can, right.
Yeah,
And we can talk about this off camera. So I don't want to.
What is the database? What information does it have?
It's a Black Genealogical Project. I know that.
And Sharon, and I'm blanking on her name, but her first
right.
name is
Yeah,
Sharon.
she's the one who
Coming to the Table.
right. She's the one who did the book with Tom, right?
Yes.
Right.
Tom
I can't remember her name.
But I mean, what kind of information does it have?
Anything like I spent a couple of days many years ago putting stuff in any instance that you have. I mean, I have in the research that I've done, there are a lot of references to names of people, like in a document, somebody was sold. And so that person, and it's almost always just a first name, Sarah, Eliza, blah, 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 Matilda. And there's a database that, and that recognizes that you're not going to have all the information. And it gives you put in, any name that you have, or even if you don't have a name, but there's somebody mentioned, you put in, where you found this, where they were, where they were. I mean, the kinds of information that you can, you don't necessarily know all of it, but, age, color, gender, what plantation they were on, any information you have. I have some instances where there were actual newspaper articles or ads by Scarlett's saying, wanted, Eliza and so, they last left, they're age 39, mulatto, has a slight limp, whatever. And they were last seen so, we think, it seems that they might have gone down to Florida where they have family, whatever. And you just put all that information in there so that people of African descent in particular, but really anybody who's researching this material can go in and say, well, my family, and try to connect the dots, right? My ancestor was.
Does it work the other way? Does it that you can put an owner's name in?
I haven't worked with this material recently. I'm sure there are databases like that. And it also, I think generally, when I did put this material in, if it was, owned by, quote unquote, owned by somebody, or they belonged to so-and-so, they fled the estate or the plantation of, Scarlett, George Scarlett or whatever, then that would be there. Or you'd put the source, right? So it's, so I think that information kind of gets in there, but there may be specific databases now. I don't know for sure. But generally speaking, it's white people who have documents and evidence and correspondence and lists and all of these things.
But many people don't. That's just what you were saying.
Black people tend not to because.
No, but white people too. You had to dig.
Oh, sure, absolutely. Stuff gets disappeared. But if you have anything, it's really. I don't want to be preachy here, but I'll be preachy. It's sort of it's a moral obligation to report this stuff and get it somewhere so that African Americans who are researching their own, trying to find their family history can find. So there were no, by and large, except for the odd advertisement, like I mentioned, or probate lists when people died. There are lists of people and what they were worth, and whatnot. I mean, and again, it's always first name. It's not there. No, the enslaved people didn't have last names. They belonged to somebody, but wasn't until 1870 and that census, that first post-war census, that suddenly they began listing these people as with last names. And in many
And
cases,
there are a
those
lot of
last
people
names,
who know what plantation, a lot of Black people who know what plantation their
right,
families were from. I mean, they have the same last name and everything.
right.
And I would think that they might like to look up the owner,
Oh, absolutely.
see, who's been reported on.
Yep, yep.
I think that, yeah, my guess, I don't know these databases, but my guess is that it would list the owner because that's a good way of finding out the names because of probate, because of wills and so forth. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
what Leslie's emphasizing here is that the census, there were, quote, slave schedules in the previous censuses in 1860, 1850, and so forth, which had no names. They had only gender and age. There were no names. And so that's why all of this gets to be, very important. No names in the census.
Yeah, I'm looking. I mean, I'm just pulling out a shot, a file, and I mean, these are just many of the things from legal documents that I pulled up. Wills, and wills are one of them where they bequeath. My slave Tom goes to my son. My slave uh, Mercy goes to so and so. So
Yeah, I think my ancestor had a will somewhere. I don't know where it is right now, but
well, Connie, I would encourage you to, if you're at all interested, you could just Google coming to the table. It comes right up.
and see
And
what they have to say. Okay, that's good.
you can easily join. They're wonderfully
Well,
welcoming.
see what they have. Yeah, interesting.
And in fact, actually, it's this Sunday. Um, they are doing they do online things. There's a section of Coming to the Table called Linked Descendants. And they are doing a session this Sunday on the 2nd of November with about genealogy and whatever else. And I don't know if I can maybe put it in the chat. I'm not very good at these things, but you could, anyhow, reach out to Coming to the Table
I
since
will
you do
look
think
at it
you're,
to see just what they do and what they have. Yes.
yeah, yeah, yeah. But that's a way of connecting, and people will give you all kinds of information.
So your book comes out in a few days. How do you
In a
feel
few
about it? How are you feeling?
Well, it's kind of weird. I mean, I wrote parts of it many years ago, and then I revised it and revised it, and so it's sort of weird. Like parts of it, as you can tell, I don't remember all of it. I spent much of this morning like reading through, like what did I write? But parts of the story I remember vividly, and then parts I don't. But so I'm really above everything else. I'm really happy that it's out, and that the story is it's the record is out, and it's not going to go away. And my family is no longer going to get away with this material. The current, forgive me for, I mean, well, don't forgive me, but the current federal Justice Building in Brunswick, Georgia, is still named the Frank M. Scarlett Building. Frank M. Scarlett was a judge. He was my grandmother's generation, so born in the turn of the last century. And he was an absolute racist. He sort of single-handedly, he became a federal district judge for southeastern Georgia, I think. And when Brown v. Board of Education came out in 1955, I think, and wanted to desegregate, he pretty single-handedly managed to keep the public schools of Savannah segregated for 10 more years because of the the income or whatever the differences, the intellectual differences between blacks and whites. And the courthouse, at least the last time I was there, which was less than a year ago, the federal courthouse in Brunswick is still named after this man. This stuff has to change. We have to keep stop honoring these people. And I happened to be in Georgia. I think it was no, I can't remember. Anyhow, it was a year or two ago, when the perpetrators, the three men who murdered Ahmaud Arbery, when this federal court said, no, you're not going to be given, you're going to go back into criminal justice and not be given a free pass because you were part of the Brunswick police when you did this. And I saw Ahmaud Arbery's mother in the parking lot. We just happened to be there, and she was talking to reporters after this information had just come out. And when I was in Brunswick this past spring, I've become a supporter of a bicycling group called Bragg. I wanted to give money. I wanted to give reparations money, serious reparations money, for me, serious, to some Black organizations. And this was one that was recommended to me. And they're wonderful. They do bicycle riding in Brunswick area. And I happened to be there when they were doing one of their rides, and they do them in honor of Ahmaud Arbery. And Arbery's father and uncle were there, and I got to meet them. And that was very moving. That was really moving. Wow. And I wanted to say something about, speaking of reparations, as Isabel Wilkerson's cast, she talks about how, if you're white American, it doesn't matter if you're a descendant of anybody, or if they emigrated in, 1920. If you're a white American, you benefit from this, our history of slavery. I mean, you just do. And so in that sense, we all owe something, I think. I feel a particular, calling to give money as I can. And when I'm writing this book, one of the decisions I made was I'm not going to not that I'm making much money. In fact, I'm losing a lot of money or spending a lot on this book. But I thought any money I make from this book, I am giving to the family, which I've done, to the Hibbard descendants. We're not talking lots of money, believe me, but I just thought I'm not earning any money from slavery, period. And I think whatever we can do for reparations is important. Whatever your conscience tells you, and this is probably, if you're a descendant of indigenous people too, making reparations, and reparations can include things like sharing your documents. Just giving them to an archive. That's reparation work. So it doesn't have to be monetary, but we need to do something. We need to do, at least this is my feeling, we need to do what we can to help repair the damage, because the damage goes on.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Well, listen, we've been talking for an hour and 15 minutes or so. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for inviting me.
Good luck with the book.
Thank you so much, and good luck with your ongoing work. Sounds like you have a possible AI interview coming up soon, which would be pretty interesting as well. That's a scary business.
All right, thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That was Leslie Stainton from the University of Michigan Residential College. Her new book is titled Scarlett: Slavery's Enduring Legacy in an American Family. And that's it for this edition of the Last Negroes at Harvard podcast. Talk to you next week. I'm Kent Garrett.